Tonight, the U.S. and Israel pummeling Iranian missile bases deep underground. ABC News verifying that 13 of the underground facilities have been damaged or destroyed.
President Trump and Defense Secretary Hegseth have made it very clear that if there is any kind of retaliation from Iran, that would lead to an even greater response.
The aircraft carrier was already burning. Not from a missile. Not from a torpedo. From a fuel line rupture on the hangar deck that had nothing to do with Iran and everything to do with a maintenance crew that had been awake for 31 hours straight. The fire was contained in 9 minutes. But for those 9 minutes, every sensor operator in the Strait of Hormuz theater was looking inward, watching damage control feeds instead of scanning outward. And somewhere on the Iranian coastline, someone noticed. This is the part that never makes it into the official timeline. The part where the world's most powerful navy blinks, and the other side decides that blink is an invitation. The collapse didn't happen overnight. It took months. A slow grinding escalation that started with diplomatic cables nobody outside the National Security Council ever read and ended with the most intense naval engagement in the Persian Gulf since 1988. The maximum pressure campaign, already stretched to its breaking point, had finally snapped something inside Tehran's calculus. The moderates who had argued for patience were sidelined. The Revolutionary Guard commanders who had spent 2 decades rehearsing for exactly this kind of confrontation were given the keys. Operation Hormuz Gatekeeper wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation. It was a plan that had been sitting in a filing cabinet inside IRGC Naval Forces headquarters on Farsi Island for years. Updated quarterly. War-gamed in exercises the Western press dismissed as propaganda theater. The operation's premise was elegant in its simplicity. You don't need to sink a carrier to win. You need to make the insurance companies believe you can. You need Lloyd's of London to pull coverage on tanker transits. You need the price of Brent crude to spike past $200 a barrel. You need the global economy to flinch. And then you negotiate from strength. The first phase wasn't kinetic at all. It was administrative. Tehran announced a formal maritime exclusion zone extending 12 nautical miles from its coastline into the shipping lanes. Every tanker captain transiting the strait received a broadcast on Channel 16, the international distress frequency, informing them that passage now required an Iranian naval escort and a transit fee of $4 per barrel of cargo. The message was repeated in English, Arabic, Farsi, and Mandarin. Some captains laughed it off. 3 Liberian-flagged tankers turned around. Washington's response was immediate and predictable. The Fifth Fleet surged assets forward. An Arleigh Burke-class Flight 3 destroyer, fresh out of a 14-month modernization at Ingalls Shipbuilding, took point position in the eastbound traffic separation scheme. The ship carried the latest Spy-6 VE-1 active electronically scanned array radar, a system so sensitive it could track a baseball at 200 nautical miles. Behind it, spread across a 40-mile arc, a second destroyer and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser formed the backbone of a surface action group. Overhead, the P-8A Poseidon out of Al Udeid maintained a continuous racetrack orbit at 25,000 feet, its belly full of sonobuoys and its crew cycling between coffee and adrenaline. The Iranians watched all of this. They had been watching for weeks. IRGC intelligence units operating from fishing dhows had mapped the patrol patterns, timed the watch rotations, catalogued the helicopter launch intervals. They knew when the Seahawks went up. They knew when they came down. They knew the P-8 as orbit shifted northeast at the top of every hour to avoid commercial air traffic inbound to Dubai. They knew about the 9-minute fire on the carrier. They had been counting on something like it. The attack order went out at 2:51 a.m. local time, transmitted not by radio but by motorcycle courier to 12 separate launch points along 90 kilometers of Iranian coastline. This was deliberate. No electronic emission. No signal for the Americans to intercept. Just a man on a Honda with a sealed envelope and a memorized authentication code. At 3:07 a.m., the first wave launched. Not from one point, from everywhere. The SBY-6 radar on the lead destroyer registered the initial contacts as sea clutter. The Strait of Hormuz at night is a noisy place. Fishing boats. Smugglers. Commercial traffic cutting corners. The automated classification algorithms sorted the returns into probability categories, and for 11 seconds, 36 inbound fast attack craft were labeled as low-confidence commercial tracks. 11 seconds doesn't sound like much. At 45 knots of closure speed, it's nearly a quarter mile. The tactical action officer caught it first. Not because the system told him. Because the pattern was wrong. Commercial boats don't accelerate in formation. He keyed the intercom and said 2 words that changed everything that night. Raid count. The Aegis combat system shifted to full automatic tracking. The number on the screen climbed.
42. 51. 63.
These weren't all real boats. Some were radar reflectors towed behind the lead craft, simple corner reflectors on styrofoam floats designed to multiply the apparent size of the attacking force. But enough of them were real.
More than enough.
The captain had roughly 90 seconds to make a decision that defense analysts would spend the next decade debating. Engage now with full offensive firepower and risk killing fishermen who might be caught in the swarm, or wait for positive identification and risk letting the fastest boats reach rocket range. He chose a middle path. Weapons free on any track exceeding 40 knots on an intercept course. Everything else, hold fire and classify. This decision probably saved the ship. It also meant that 17 of the slower IRGC boats, the ones carrying the real payload, kept coming unchallenged for another 4 minutes. At 3:12 a.m., the MH-60R Seahawk, already airborne on a routine anti-submarine patrol, received flash tasking from the destroyer's Combat Information Center. The pilot banked hard south and pushed the collective forward, dropping from 800 feet to 150 feet in a gut-churning descent that left the sensor operator gripping his console. Through the multispectral targeting system's infrared window, the ocean below looked like a kicked ant hill. Bright white thermal blooms scattered across black water, each one a boat engine running at full throttle. The crew prioritized the command and control boats. Iranian doctrine placed the senior officer in the second or third vessel in each attack column, not the lead. The lead boats were expendable. The command boats carried the encrypted radios that held the swarm together. The sensor operator identified them by their antenna arrays, visible in infrared as slightly cooler lines against the hot engine signature. He designated 2. The pilot steadied the aircraft. 2 AGM-114R Hellfire missiles dropped from the stub wings and ignited, streaking toward the water in shallow arcs that ended in twin flashes and a brief silence on the Iranian command net.
The swarm didn't stop.
But it fractured. Without centralized command, the individual boat groups reverted to their pre-briefed attack plans, which had been designed to work in concert. Independently, they were still dangerous. Coordinated, they would have been devastating. This is where the Iranians played their second card. The one the Americans hadn't fully anticipated. At 3:22 a.m., the coastal electronic warfare sites activated simultaneously. Not jamming in the traditional sense. These were Chinese-supplied systems, modified versions of the Type 726-4 land-based jammer, capable of generating dense electromagnetic noise across the entire S-band spectrum. The SBY-6 radar didn't go blind. It got overwhelmed. Imagine trying to listen to a whisper in a stadium full of screaming fans. The radar was still functioning. It just couldn't hear anything useful over the noise. Simultaneously, from cave mouths and camouflaged revetments along the Hormuzgan coastline, launch crews began firing Ababil 3 drones.
Not as weapons. As decoys.
Each drone carried a Lüneburg lens, a simple spherical radar reflector that made a 50-pound drone look like a 500-ton patrol boat on radar. The Aegis system, already straining against the jamming, now had to contend with hundreds of new tracks that didn't correspond to anything real. The operators were drowning in data. Every screen in the Combat Information Center looked like a snow globe that someone had shaken violently and refused to put down. The third card came from the cliffs. The FAR 5 rocket batteries embedded in the limestone ridges above the strait opened fire at 3:28 a.m. But they weren't aiming at the destroyer. They were aiming at the water around it. 243-33mm rockets launched in a 60-second barrage, impacting the sea surface in a pre-calculated grid pattern extending 800 meters in every direction from the ship. Each impact threw a column of seawater 15 meters into the air. The cumulative effect was a wall of atomized saltwater that hung in the air like fog, saturating the infrared sensors, scattering the laser designators, and creating a physical obscurant that no amount of electronic sophistication could see through. Inside the Combat Information Center, the air tasted like ozone and tension. The electronic warfare officer was cycling through every countermeasure in the SLQ-32V7 systems library. The weapons coordinators were trying to sort real targets from ghosts. The captain stood behind them all and did the hardest thing a commanding officer can do in combat.
He waited.
He waited because he understood something the Iranians didn't know he understood. The P-8A Poseidon at 25,000 feet was above the jamming.
Above the spray. Above the chaos.
Its APS-154 radar, operating on a different frequency band than the ship's Spy-6, was cutting through the electronic noise like a lighthouse through fog. The Poseidon's crew had been watching the real picture the entire time. They knew which tracks were boats and which were decoys. They knew where the rocket batteries were. They knew something else too. Something that was about to change the geometry of the entire engagement. At 3:34 a.m., the Poseidon sensor operator identified a series of metallic returns just beneath the surface along the main shipping channel. The acoustic signature was distinctive, a low-frequency hum that matched the known profile of the Sadaf 02 moored contact mine. Iran had preceded the escape routes. The Americans weren't just being attacked. They were being herded. The swarm was pushing the destroyer south. The mines were waiting in the south. The rocket barrage was preventing movement east or west. It was a kill box, and the ship was already inside it. The Poseidon transmitted the minefield coordinates via Link 16. The data appeared on the destroyer's tactical display as a constellation of red diamonds forming a neat crescent across the only viable maneuvering water south of the ship's position. The navigator looked at the captain. The captain looked at the mine plot. Then he looked at the inbound swarm tracks, still converging from the north and east. He gave an order that broke every doctrine manual in the Surface Warfare Officer's School. He ordered the ship to accelerate directly into the swarm. The logic was counterintuitive but sound. The mines were to the south.
The swarm was to the north. The swarm he could shoot. The mines he couldn't.
Moving north meant closing the engagement range, which was dangerous, but it also meant putting distance between his hull and the explosive charges anchored to the seabed. He would rather fight the enemy he could see than the one hiding beneath him. The destroyer surged forward at 31 knots, its gas turbines howling, its wake carving a white scar across the black water. The Phalanx CWS mounts on both sides of the superstructure spun up simultaneously, their search radars painting the incoming boats with targeting energy. The system's engagement logic was simple and merciless. Anything moving faster than 20 knots on a collision course inside 1,500 meters received a burst of 20mm tungsten penetrator rounds. The M61A1 Gatling guns began firing in controlled bursts, each one a distinctive buzzing roar that the crew felt in their teeth more than heard with their ears. Tracers stitched across the water in luminous white lines. The first IRGC speedboat to reach the engagement envelope was a 13-meter Blade Runner derivative carrying a 500-kilogram shaped charge in its bow. The Phalanx system tracked it for 1.2 seconds, calculated its trajectory, and put 40 rounds into its engine block. The boat decelerated violently, slewed sideways, and detonated its own warhead prematurely, sending a geyser of flame and fiberglass into the air 400 meters off the port beam. Close enough to rattle coffee mugs.
Not close enough to kill.
The second and third boats came together, splitting at the last moment in a practiced fork maneuver designed to force the CWS to choose one target.
The system chose both.
The Block 1B Phalanx with its integrated FLIR camera could track multiple targets simultaneously, and the guns on opposite sides of the ship engaged independently.
2 more fireballs.
2 more columns of oily smoke rising into the humid night air. But the fourth boat got through. It came from the east, masked by the spray from the Far 5 barrage, riding low in the water with its engine barely above idle until the last 300 meters. Then it accelerated to 52 knots and aimed directly for the waterline amidships. The Phalanx mount on the starboard side was cycling between targets. It acquired the boat at 280 meters. It began firing at 240 meters. The rounds chewed through the fiberglass hull, killed the pilot, and shattered the steering mechanism. But momentum is a physical law that doesn't care about bullets. The dead boat, now an unguided projectile, struck the destroyer's hull at an oblique angle, carving a 3-meter gash above the waterline before sliding off and sinking.
No detonation.
The shaped charge required a direct perpendicular impact to function. The angle saved the ship. Pure geometry.
Pure luck.
Damage control teams were in the passageway before the impact vibrations faded. The gash was above the waterline.
No flooding.
Structural damage only. The ship was still in the fight. At 3:51 a.m., the captain authorized full activation of the electronic warfare suite. Not the defensive systems that had been running all along. The offensive capability. The SLQ-32V7 system focused a concentrated beam of electromagnetic energy across the strait, not jamming specific frequencies but flooding the entire electromagnetic spectrum with overwhelming power. The effect on the Iranian side was catastrophic. GPS receivers burned out. Radio circuits overloaded. The navigation screens on every IRGC boat within 8 nautical miles went white, then black, then displayed nothing at all. The Ababil decoy drones, relying on GPS for their loitering patterns, lost guidance and began spiraling into the water like leaves falling from a dead tree. The coordinated swarm became an uncoordinated mob. And uncoordinated mobs die quickly in modern naval warfare. At 3:58 a.m., 2 aircraft that had been holding at 15,000 feet above the Omani side of the strait received clearance to engage. They were A-10C Thunderbolt IIs out of Al Dhafra, configured for the maritime strike role that almost nobody outside of a few classified exercise reports believed they could perform. Each aircraft carried a mixed loadout of GBU-12 Paveway 2 laser-guided bombs, AGM-65 Maverick missiles, and a full combat load of 1,174 rounds of 30mm PGU-14/B armor-piercing incendiary ammunition for the GU-8/A Avenger cannon that occupied most of the aircraft's forward fuselage. The A-10 is not a glamorous aircraft.
It is slow. It is ugly.
It flies like a bathtub with aspirations. But it was built for exactly this kind of work.
Low. Slow. Precise. Patient.
It can loiter over a battlefield for hours, and its titanium armor bathtub protects the pilot from ground fire up to 23mm. Against the 12.7mm machine guns mounted on IRGC speedboats, the A-10 was effectively bulletproof. The lead pilot, callsign Hog-1, descended through a gap in the electronic noise, following a corridor the Poseidon had identified as relatively clear of Iranian radar coverage. The aircraft dropped below 500 feet over the Omani coastline, crossed the shipping lane at 300 feet, and entered the combat zone from the south, behind the Iranian boats that were all oriented north toward the destroyer. The first pass was surgical. Through the sniper advanced targeting pod, the pilot could see individual figures on the decks of the attack boats. He selected the largest cluster, a group of 8 boats that had reformed after the electronic warfare pulse and were attempting to coordinate a second rush. The Avenger cannon fired a 4-second burst. At 3,900 rounds per minute, that was 260 rounds of depleted uranium, each one capable of penetrating an inch of rolled steel. The rounds walked across the formation like a zipper being pulled across fabric. 3 boats disintegrated immediately. 2 more caught fire and began to list. The remaining 3 scattered in panic, their pilots unable to comprehend what was killing them from a direction they hadn't been watching.
The wingman, Hog-2, went after the coastal targets.
The Poseidon had been building a target list for the past 40 minutes, identifying the FAR 5 launch sites by their thermal signatures and correlating them with the known positions from pre-war intelligence assessments. Hog-2 made 2 passes along the clifftop, releasing 4 GBU-12 bombs in sequence. Each 500-pound bomb, guided by a laser beam transmitted from the Poseidon's targeting system, struck within 3 feet of its aim point. The first bomb sealed a cave entrance that had been serving as an ammunition staging area. The secondary explosion from the munitions inside blew the sealed entrance back open, along with a significant portion of the cliff face above it. The second bomb struck a mobile launcher that was in the process of reloading. The third and fourth destroyed a radar installation and a communications relay that had been coordinating the drone launches. The coastal fire went silent. At 4:14 a.m., with the surface threat degraded and the coastal batteries neutralized, the focus shifted beneath the waves. The mine threat was still real. The Poseidon had identified at least 40 probable mine positions across the main shipping channel. These were Savath 02 variants, moored contact mines anchored to the seabed at a preset depth, designed to strike the hull of deep draft tankers and warships. Clearing them would normally take days. The Navy didn't have days. The MH-60R Seahawk, now operating with 2 additional helicopters launched from the second destroyer, began a systematic mine hunting operation using the Airborne Laser Mine Detection System, a blue-green laser that could penetrate 30 meters of water and return a 3-dimensional image of objects on the seabed. The system was originally designed for deeper water, but the relatively shallow Strait of Hormuz, averaging 80 meters in the shipping lanes, was well within its capability. Each identified mine was marked with a GPS-tagged sonobuoy dropped nearby, creating a digital map of the minefield that was shared across the fleet in real time. Navy EOD divers would clear the mines later. For now, the map gave the ships a safe corridor to navigate through the field, threading between the explosive obstacles with margins measured in tens of meters.
Not comfortable, but survivable.
At 4:31 a.m., the destroyer's Mark 45 Mod 4 naval gun, the 5-inch weapon on the bow, opened fire for the first time that night.
Not at boats. Not at aircraft.
At the water itself, the gun fired a series of naval fire support rounds, programmable airburst munitions set to detonate at 3 meters above the surface. The fragments from each round created a lethal zone 50 meters in diameter, shredding anything on the water within that radius. The gun crew walked the fire systematically across the northern approach, creating a wall of fragmentation that no small boat could penetrate. The last 6 IRGC speedboats, the ones that had been lurking at the edge of the engagement zone waiting for an opening, turned and ran. 2 made it back to the coast.
4 did not. By 4:45 a.m., the strait was quiet.
The water was covered in debris. Fuel slicks spread rainbow patterns across the surface. Small fires burned on fragments of fiberglass hulls that hadn't yet sunk. The smell of burning petroleum and cordite drifted across the deck of the destroyer where the crew stood at their battle stations, some of them realizing for the first time that their hands were shaking. The Poseidon continued its orbit overhead, now scanning for any sign of a second wave.
There was none.
The IRGC's coastal communications network was in ruins. The mobile launchers were destroyed or buried. The drone inventory was expended. The fast attack boat flotilla that had trained for this mission for years was scattered across the seabed in pieces too small to identify. At 5:15 a.m., the first commercial tanker transited the strait under U.S. escort. A Greek-flagged VLCC carrying 2 million barrels of Kuwaiti crude oil, its captain visibly nervous on the bridge, edging past the marked minefield at 6 knots with a destroyer 800 meters ahead, its sonar pinging actively, its guns still manned. The tanker made it through without incident. The second followed 30 minutes later. By mid-morning, 6 tankers had passed. By afternoon, the transit fee broadcast on Channel 16 had stopped. The damage assessment took weeks to finalize. The IRGC lost an estimated 37 fast attack craft, destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 4 coastal missile and rocket batteries were neutralized. 2 drone storage facilities were collapsed. An unknown number of personnel were killed. The U.S. destroyer sustained the single hull gash from the glancing impact. No American fatalities. 3 sailors treated for minor injuries from loose equipment thrown by the impact. The Seahawk took 7 rounds of small arms fire through its tail section and flew back to the ship anyway. But the numbers don't capture what actually happened that night. What happened was that Iran tested its most rehearsed, most invested, most doctrinally central military capability against the system it was specifically designed to defeat.
And it lost. Not in a close fight.
Not in a Pyrrhic exchange. It lost comprehensively, in under 2 hours, against a single surface action group that didn't even call for carrier air support until the shooting was already over. The strategic implications rippled outward for months. Iran's deterrence posture in the Gulf, built over decades on the credible threat of closing the strait, was functionally demolished in a single night. The insurance premiums that Tehran had counted on to weaponize global commerce never materialized. The oil markets spiked for 72 hours, then settled. The world watched, recalculated, and moved on. The deeper miscalculation was doctrinal. The IRGC had designed its entire naval strategy around the assumption that swarm tactics, combined with mines and coastal defense, could create an anti-access environment too costly for the U.S. Navy to contest. The assumption rested on the belief that quantity had a quality of its own, that enough small boats moving fast enough could overwhelm the sensors and weapons of a modern warship. They were wrong because they underestimated integration. Not any single weapon. Not the Spy-6 radar, or the Phalanx guns, or the A-10s, or the Poseidon. The integration. The ability to fuse data from a dozen sensors operating on different frequencies, in different domains, at different altitudes, into a single coherent picture and distribute that picture to every shooter in the theater in real time. The IRGC attacked a ship. The U.S. Navy defended with a network. And networks win. There was one final detail that emerged weeks later in a classified after-action review. At 3:14 a.m., 3 minutes after the initial raid count, an IRGC Goddard-class midget submarine had been detected by sonobuoys moving slowly toward the traffic separation scheme from the east. It was carrying 2 heavyweight torpedoes. If it had reached firing position, the engagement would have looked very different. But the Poseidon crew had been tracking it since it left port 18 hours earlier. An MH-60A was vectored to its position. The submarine's captain, hearing active sonobuoy pings closing from multiple directions, chose to surface and withdraw rather than attack. Nobody fired a shot. Nobody had to. The submarine's crew knew they had been seen. And being seen, in modern naval warfare, means being dead. That single moment, a submarine surfacing in the dark and turning for home, might have been the most important event of the entire night. Not the explosions. Not the cannon fire. Not the burning boats. A quiet decision by a man in a metal tube who understood that the war was already lost. He just didn't want to be the last one to find out.